Hey everybody, this is Ben Kesnoka, co-founder and partner at Village Global, a network-driven venture firm. And this is our podcast, where we go deep on all things business and technology with world-leading experts.
Hello, everybody. My name is Olga Serhiyevich, and I'm head of investor relations at Village Global. I am excited to introduce one of my favorite authors as our guest today, Sebastian Mallaby. Sebastian wrote a number of books about different parts of the financial services industry, including The Power Law, Venture Capital, and Making of the New Future, The Man Who Knew the Life and Times of Alan Greenspan, and More Money Than God, Hedge Funds and the Making of a New Elite. During his career at The Economist and other publications, Sebastian also got a chance to write about a number of important historical events, including the release of Nelson Mandela during his work in Africa. In today's conversation, we'll talk about Sebastian's insights on covering important historical events, on different industries that he wrote about, and how technology is changing the world around us. Sebastian, welcome to Village Global Stories.
Yeah, great to be with you, Olga.
So let's start at the beginning. You've spent time studying and working at some of the most admired institutions in the world, from Oxford University to The Economist to Council on Foreign Relations. What are some of the surprising things about these institutions that you learned being a part of them?
So I think there's a theory about institutions that they mold people and they shape them, they help them to grow professionally. And that's true, but I think it's done in a pretty subtle way sometimes. And I'd say that the surprise when it comes to Oxford University, The Economist, the Council on Foreign Relations is that they kind of leave it up to you a lot. So when I was an undergraduate, I would go see a professor for maybe 1.5 hours per week. And the rest of the time, I had a long list of books I was supposed to read and a large amount of words I was supposed to write. And it was kind of up to me to figure out what I would do with that. And then at The Economist, I remember I joined as an intern at first. I was 22 years old. And the first week they said, so what article are you proposing? And I had to come up with the idea. I had to pitch it, sell it, and I had to execute on it. And they didn't care that there were other people with exactly the same three duties who were 52, not 22. And it was sort of just, from day one up to me to generate ideas. And again, at the Council on Foreign Relations, it's very much a kind of, each senior fellow there is pretty much a solo intellectual entrepreneur. And yes, we get together on calls and in meetings. Yes, we have a terrific sort of institutional mechanism for distributing our work through our website and through podcasts and whatever. But the idea generation and the writing that we each do is pretty solo. And so I'd say the commonality and the surprise is how much in the end is up to the individual.
And do you still remember the title or the topic of your first article at The Economist?
Well, I remember it was about Lebanon because Lebanon was then as now, a difficult country to be based in as a Westerner, and I think probably even harder back then in the 80s. And so there was no correspondent for The Economist who was based in Lebanon. So I figured that this gave me an entrance, as the sort of desk-bound person in London, at least initially. They couldn't say, yeah, but you're not on the ground, because nobody was on the ground. So if I did enough reading and managed to find enough spooks and, diplomats who had just come back from there, or whatever, I could put together a story and pass the test.
So it's an interesting insight about these institutions giving you a lot of freedom to follow your intellectual curiosity, and but at the same time, still get a lot done and stay focused on certain types of objectives that you might have. And recently, there's been a lot of conversations about work from home, about remote work, and some companies have very strong views on someone's ability to deliver the same results when they are self-directed and not in an office, not in a structured environment. So what would you say? Like what are some of the qualities, what is the type of a person who you would say would be successful in a self-directed environment versus not, as perhaps part of the reflection on this topic of remote work and effectiveness?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, paradoxically, given what I've just been saying about being pretty self-directed at these institutions, I do believe in going into the office and the value of seeing colleagues and so forth. And in my case, that was a lot about friendship. I mean, I just made really close friendships with the people I was working with at all of those places. And, I think if you're engaged in fairly self-directed, fairly independent work, which is what writers do, you do need still human contact. And psychologically, emotionally, just in terms of your morale, that's really important. So that's one thing I would say. And also, I don't want to, give the impression that the value of the institution in shaping your work is nothing. There is feedback. So you direct yourself, the idea in doing it, but then you're going to be told by colleagues if it's any good or not, and how could it be better. And all of those three institutions, Oxford University, The Economist, and the Council on Foreign Relations, put a lot of energy into feedback. So, obviously at Oxford, there were serious exams, which took professors a long time to grade, but they took that seriously. At The Economist, the editing was really intensive. And if one of my big debts is to a terrific older journalist called Nick Harmon, who sadly died recently. But I remember him calling me into his office when I'd written an article, and he was going to edit it. And he would say, well, have a chair next to me because I'm going to bash it about a bit. And then he would get it on the screen. He would say, just a bit more topspin on this sentence. And then he would tweak it, 2 or 3 small ways. And I would watch him do this. And I would think, whoa, yes, that's quite subtle changes, but it adds to this sort of sense of urgency in the sentence, or it just cuts out 3 words out of 15, and that just reduces the drag factor. And so I really, learned a lot from that. And equally at the Council on Foreign Relations, there is a very serious, review process. If you do a council-sponsored book, they're going to review the idea at the beginning. They're going to review what you do at the end. They're going to make you redo some of it. So and that's very important. So even though you're self-directed for like 80, 90% of the time, that other 10, 20% is really important in developing as a professional.
So the key really is human connection and a feedback loop.
Yeah. So I'd say that, for example, I mean, I have a 27-year-old daughter who is finishing her PhD at University of Chicago in astrophysics. And she does the kind of work which I believe she can do, pretty independently. And she's very self-directed about it. But I think she would agree that going into a lab or going to a conference in the summer gives you that, human to human connection, which is kind of important to your morale.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think there's a lot to be said about being surrounded by people who are doing something in your industry, but then sort of calibrating the ambition and goals and things, right? Because you never know if what you are trying to accomplish sounds like a huge, crazy goal, or maybe you're not pushing yourself hard enough. So part of the value of these gatherings and being surrounded by your peers is also just that. And we'll talk about lots of different places and industries, but I think that's one of the reasons that Wall Street and New York has always been so incredibly ambitious and hardworking is because you're surrounded by other people who are like that, right? And they push you much, much further than a lot of the other cultures and environments. And of course, every environment pushes you in some ways, right? But it's really being surrounded by a lot of people going towards the same goal that has that interesting component. So let's move into your writing. You've written books about hedge funds, about international finance, most recently about venture capital, and I love all that because selfishly it follows my career and encompasses all of my interests. But Tell us a little bit about your reflections on the types of players and motivations and what you've seen in these different areas of the capital intermediation industry. How are they similar and different?
Well, starting with the power law, my book on venture capital, what struck me was the incredible willingness to network and connect me with other people. Every time I finished a good conversation with somebody, that person would typically say, well, how can I be helpful? Would I like an introduction to somebody else? And if I said, well, yeah, there's these two people, they would actually do it. And, they would expend personal capital in connecting me with other people, which frankly, in New York, I did not find at all. And weirdly, the only people who made me promises about connecting me to others and then totally failed to deliver were like the non-Silicon Valley, non-startup people. They kind of said it, but they didn't mean it. Oh yeah, great. Great to meet you. Yeah, well, I'm a professor at Stanford these days, so when you come out to Silicon Valley, let me know and I'll organize a dinner for you. Not, that because these people were fundamentally not of the startup culture. So I think that extroversion, that the essence of being a VC, I joke, is you get up in the morning, you have breakfast with one person, you have 14 cups of coffee, hopefully decaffeinated before you go to bed, because it's all about meeting the next person you might fund, the person you funded last month who's now having a problem and you have to help them, the 5 engineers who might be the first hires to some startup that you funded a couple of months ago. It's all about connecting people, meeting people, assessing people, and all that. Whereas in hedge fund space, I remember going to see Louis Bacon, a famous macro trader, and he was hiding behind about 3 screens with all this financial data on his screen and hardly kind of put his head around the side when I arrived. And people used to joke that when Louis Bacon did well and he bought himself a private island, it made no difference because he was so insular. Anyway, now if you add in then the central bankers, okay, because I wrote this biography of Alan Greenspan, the man who knew, I would say that what stands out relative to the sort of private investor world is this extreme risk aversion and kind of willingness to be theoretical and never mind the practical, and not sort of necessarily look at the results of what you do, but look at the theory of what you're doing. These are quite striking tribal features when you study central bankers. So, for example, it is unbelievable that Silicon Valley Bank had assigned to it some rather large number of Federal Reserve supervisors full-time on Silicon Valley Bank. I was told this by I probably shouldn't name who exactly, but somebody at Silicon Valley Bank who was very senior, who said, yeah, there were these people from the San Francisco Fed and they were assigned to watch over us. That was all they did. Guess how many there were? And I said, well, 2. And he goes, no, it's like 2 orders of magnitude more than that. Think 200 and something. I mean, so they do all this, but they plainly didn't spot that, hey, interest rates are rising, which they should know about since they're from the Fed and that's what's raising rates. Interest rates are rising. So, the bond portfolio held by Silicon Valley Bank is going to be killed in value. And that's going to be a problem. I mean, what were they thinking? And I think in the same way, I would have conversations with macroeconomists and they would say, we've got everything, I'm talking about Federal Reserve macroeconomists, we've got everything worked out. We've figured out how to target inflation. And I would go, yeah, you're very good at the price of eggs, making those stable. But what about the nest eggs? The savings, the capital market bubbles that are going on. Asset prices are going through the roof. And you're telling me you have it all figured out. And they say, oh, don't worry. That's where the regulation will fix it. And I say, well, it hasn't fixed it in the past. Are you sure it's going to fix it? And of course, it doesn't fix it. But they are so pleased to have discovered the model for how to do, inflation targeting and all that they would ignore the practical consequences of not adjusting rates in the face of asset price bubbles. So I'd say, yeah, to sum it up, central bankers, super theoretical, money-making investors, much more practical, much more results-oriented. But in one case, you've got venture capitalists who are, schmoozers, connectors, extroverts. And on the other case, you've got these introverted hedge fund people who, in a sense, it's not a good thing if they like hanging out with fellow investors, because then they might say what their trade is, and then that trade will be copied and it will become crowded and you can't get out of it. And yeah, so those are some of the differences.
And if you had to choose one of these industries to spend the next 20 years in, what would you choose?
Well, if I couldn't be a writer, I think venture investing would be top of the list. It's just it looks like so much fun. I mean, the whole world of dealing in bold aspirations about the future and running these iterative experiments with each startup being an experiment and hanging out with these incredibly ambitious, optimistic people. I mean, it's just terrific. I would, yeah. Weirdly, when I was leaving Oxford, I had an offer to do a master's at Stanford when Stanford was not quite what it became later. This was like the mid-'80s. And I thought, Stanford, Schmanford. And I just went straight to The Economist magazine, became a journalist instead. Maybe that was the wrong turn. I don't know.
Well, venture capital is certainly a lot of fun. And I know in the past you mentioned intellectual curiosity as one of the main driving forces of your career. So this is certainly the place where you can continue following your intellectual curiosity in pretty much any direction. Without any limits for a very long time. Yes, well, if you decide to try something new, give us a call. Let's talk a little bit more about the power law. So this is your book about venture capital. It was written a couple of years ago, and in the last few years, lots of things changed, particularly with some of the geography, some of the industry coverage. A couple of different sort of transitions at some of the prominent firms. So as you think about, have any of your conclusions about the industry or anything maybe changed from where you left off in the book?
So I'll mention three things where partly I'm kind of going to mention things which people might think I missed, but I'm not sure I did. So the biggest obvious elephant in the room is that the market, the valuations collapsed. So I published the book in February of 2022. It's right around the peak. There's been obviously a massive reckoning with collapsing valuations and people, having to figure that out and just not doing deals for 12, 18 months. But, I write quite a bit in the book about the cycles of bubbles, and I explain why bubbles are just inevitable in venture capital, because you don't have an off switch as a VC. You can't just, you can't go short the asset class, unlike in hedge fund investing. And you can't really even express a negative view verbally, because you're trying to syndicate into other deals led by other VCs. And if you want to lead the next round or be included in this round, obviously you're not going to say something negative about the other VC's other deal. So I think there's a kind of code of silence. And furthermore, if you wanted to invent a kind of joke scenario in which there's groupthink, you would put all of the investors on one road. We'll call it Sandhill Road. And we'll say there'll only be one great, hotel, restaurant, bar. We'll call it the Rosewood, and everyone will hang out together. Of course, that's going to foster some groupthink. And you'll be on boards together, startups. You'll rub shoulders, and So I think it's necessarily like that, and that's also, by the way, a strength. That's where you get the networking and the kind of fluidity of ideas that move around that ecosystem so efficiently. But there's this negative side, which is that there are going to be bubbles. And in fact, there's a chart at the back of the book that talks about the unicorn bubble, even though it hadn't burst yet. And so I don't think I missed that, but it clearly was a big change after the book came out. Second thing is, I make I devote a lot of space to Sequoia. And I did that because it was just sort of acknowledged to be the best venture firm out there. And it had also been very bold in moving beyond just Series A boutique investing in Silicon Valley, and it had gone international to China, etc., China, India, Europe, and it had done growth equity, it had a hedge fund business, and so on. And since the book came out, some of that stuff has had to be reappraised, right? So because of the geopolitics, they severed their relationship with the China Sequoia operation while they were at it. They sort of spun out the Indian operation too, although they've kept the European one. The strategy of doing longer holding periods and indeed holding companies that you liked from Series A through into your growth fund and then in your hedge fund after they go public, it doesn't look so great when the public markets collapse, and you probably should have sold some of those hedge fund positions instead of just being faithfully long these companies that you've backed since Series A. So, that on top of the embarrassment of having invested in FTX, the embarrassment of having backed Elon Musk's, ill-fated takeover of Twitter, which in my view was actually much worse than FTX because that was sort of a M&A transaction. It wasn't even a venture deal. So why did Sequoia need to be in it? And it was a big check, whereas the FTX check was de minimis for a firm like Sequoia. So I think there have been, Sequoia's been forced to adapt and it's taken a few hits. But I don't, again, think this is a fundamental sort of problem with my thesis because, venture companies always face adversity. And indeed, I describe many moments in the history of Sequoia where things went wrong. The first growth fund they did was a disaster. The first few years in India were a disaster. Indeed, the first year or so in China was a disaster. So it's all about the grit and the judgment of figuring out when you keep going and forge ahead. The third thing is there's been an ongoing, I think, expansion of VC outside the Silicon Valley core. And that had begun before, I published the book, and I do write about Sequoia moving into China and India, and a little bit I mentioned, the Israeli market and so on. I think it's gone further. I didn't say more about it in my book because there's this thing about writing chronological history, narratives, where if you explain about the 1970s and you say, okay, Kleiner Perkins and Sequoia were set up in the same year in 1972, it's elegant in narrative terms to stick with the story later on in the book of the firms you've introduced at the beginning, because it's like a personality that the reader recognizes. You don't have to start from scratch introducing them and saying who they are. So I did stick with, Sequoia, Excel, Kleiner Perkins, Benchmark, the sort of obvious suspects, Masayoshi Son, and so on. And I introduced some new ones like, Founders Fund and Y Combinator from the 2005 and forward period, Tiger Global. But I didn't really go and write about European venture operators like Atomico. And it's not that I don't respect them. It's just that they didn't, my book would have just become too big. I didn't want to write Game of Thrones or something, umpteen series long. So, but I do think that this has become more and more interesting. And the way that during lockdown, people did deals over Zoom obviously can expand the scope of the geography you operate on. And I'm super bullish on European tech. I think that, Europe has more software engineers, believe it or not, than the United States. It has a bigger consumer market than the United States. What it has lacked has been that entrepreneurial, let's go for it, take a risk kind of mentality historically. But once you introduce venture capitalists into the mix and they are willing to, finance risk, and furthermore, if the entrepreneur fails but really made a show of leaving everything on the battlefield, really working their guts out and being smart about it, but then some big rival came and, sunk them, well, give them a second shot, and funding the founder for a second time turns a one-shot super risky game into a repetitive multi-shot game, which is therefore less risky because although, there's this cliche, the venture capitalist is diversified across a lot of bets, whereas, the entrepreneur only has one bet. But over time, the entrepreneur can have more than one bet which de-risks the entrepreneur a bit. So anyway, I think that as you watch venture capitalists move into Europe, which they are doing, and as you watch founders who have worked, let's say, in Google or Microsoft in the Valley, and then they come back to their native Greece or their native Sweden or wherever they came from originally, and then they set up a startup there. I mean, this is happening all the time. I was on a call this morning about with a European-based VC who's actually an American, but wants to fund startups which are popping up all over Europe from Europeans with Silicon Valley experience. So I just think it's that the momentum is there, the market is big enough, the tech savvy is big enough. And when you've got that underwriting of risk from venture capital, there's nothing but upside in Europe.
Well, it's good to hear reasons to be bullish on the region, and the world is certainly becoming more and more global. More and more entrepreneurs we meet in different countries, when we ask them, whether they're building their product for the country, they just say from the very beginning they're building it for the world. And you sort of, you used to have this dynamic with companies in Israel, but now you see it more often with India. You see it very often in Europe and everything else. So as the world is becoming global, it only makes sense that finance follows it. And we certainly believe that ideas and talent is distributed all over the world. And so the more, we enable those founders to start building companies, the better that is, to have economic opportunity elsewhere. But having said that, there's still a lot of magic in Silicon Valley. And so maybe another question on the book. Have you had any, I'd assume you had a lot of conversations after the book, and probably most of the feedback was positive, because it's way more fun to say good things to somebody. But was there any, perhaps negative feedback or something that people challenged you on with respect to this book?
Well, there were Europeans who said, why did you leave us out? And so I explained why I left them out. So that was one category of complaint. John Doerr was not super happy because in my book, I describe how during his sort of solo leadership of Kleiner Perkins after Vinod Khosla left, basically Kleiner Perkins went from hero to zero, right? It was the best venture capital partnership in the world, circa 2001, and you can track that by looking either at public stuff, look at the Midas list and see which partnerships the top people come from. And, in 2001, the number one was Vinod Khosla from Kleiner Perkins, and the number three, if I remember right, was John Doerr from Kleiner Perkins. I mean, they really were strong. But I've also kind of double-checked that by talking to the big endowments that allocate to lots of different partnerships and saying, well, which were the best in this period? And Kleiner Perkins, basically in the 90s, was the strongest. And so they were number one. And if you look at most people's league table of where they were, 10, 15 years later, they were not even in the top 10. And because there is some path dependency in venture performance, because reputation gives you access to deal flow, it takes some doing to screw up so badly that you go from number one to not even in the top 10. And I kind of described, why John Doerr is a really good messianic technologist who can really sell a company idea like nobody else can. But he was not the right guy, I don't think, to be the managing partner by himself without any sort of check and balance from strong co-partners around the table who'd sort of, grown up with him, had known him long enough to really challenge him when he needed to be challenged and say, no, John, you're wrong about that. Or, John, you're completely neglecting that, we've got people working for this partnership who might be associates or something, and they need to be developed so that they can be the next generation of talent, and we're not spending enough time on that, whatever the issue was. And so I think it shows the difference between being a great investor, which John Doerr was, and being a great manager, which he wasn't.
Yep. And certainly things change, right? As every industry goes through different cycles. Many firms sometimes, come back strongly, and so we'll see how it all continues to develop. So maybe let's change topics a little bit. In 2015, you helped to found a startup, infacts.org, which was focused on making a fact-based case for Britain to remain in the European Union. Now, we know how the story ended. So what were some of your learnings about changing minds with facts from that entrepreneurial journey?
Yeah, that's a great question, Olga. I mean, I think what I learned was that it's not enough to be right. It's not enough to have the facts on your side. I mean, I chose that title, In Facts, for this website because it was, a factual website with facts saying why you should be in Europe, not out of it. And the technique was when Boris Johnson or some pro-Brexit person made a speech saying why it was important to leave, you just find the factual errors, which is another way of saying the lies, in what they were saying. It was pretty easy to find them, and you correct them. And because my co-founders and I were, pretty senior journalists in London, we had friends at the BBC, friends at other news outlets, and we kind of became a source for them because we'd done the sort of the spade work of pointing out these factual errors, and then other news sources would use that work to, we hope, to correct these politicians and sort of shame them and show them up as being wrong. And they did do that, the other media organizations. But the net of it all was that, Remain lost and leave, get out of Europe, they won, although they were making stuff up. Now, what does that tell us? It tells us that to win an argument, people have to kind of believe in you personally. They have to know you and like you. And I think that's what Boris Johnson had. Somehow he connected as a public personality. People just liked him. And they didn't want to ask if he was being truthful because they liked him. And I think that's an important message for, startup founders to think about. So that if you're trying to persuade an investor to invest or an early employee to jump ship and join you, it's not just about the facts and like the data on the total addressable market or whatever. It's also, do people know you and trust you and like you and want to be with you and feel like they want to join your team? And that's kind of an emotional thing. That's why that quality of extrovert, liking to be with other people is really important in this business. So I think this is probably obvious to anyone who's been in it for a while. But if you're considering going in, you have to probably look yourself in the mirror and say, am I the kind of person whose skill is, data analysis or kind of that kind of stuff? Or is my skill sort of more in face-to-face persuasion? Because it's the latter that turns out to matter a lot in startups.
So that's a really interesting reflection as we think about how technology is changing everything around. And we've seen with social media companies, and we've seen with so much content out there, and the difficulty of maintaining integrity of that information on the internet today, right? And it's only going to compound with more and more content being out there. And so, very often people think that the solution to challenges of technology is more technology, right? And we can certainly create a lot of different systems to do fact checking as somebody is speaking. But but what you're saying is that that's not enough, right? And as trust in institutions is declining continuously, it's not going to be enough that this reputable institution fact checked and provided a different perspective. There has to be something or someone who would have that ability to develop trust and likability with the audience, to be able to maintain truth on the internet, which is so important for functioning societies. So that's a really interesting idea to reflect on. And continuing with the drama and sort of interesting times that you got a chance to witness and write about, you wrote a book where you covered the release of Nelson Mandela and the collapse of apartheid. What were some of your insights about writing about such emotionally charged political events in history? And what was it like, to be somewhere where so much was happening that was just, truly important?
So being outside Nelson Mandela's jail when he walked out free in, let me get this right, 1990, was, such a sort of intense experience that I thought that although I was only 25, my career would be downhill forever thereafter, because nothing could match that. I mean, one memory I have is, I was outside the jail when he came out, and then he was quickly bundled into a car and driven to Cape Town, about an hour away, where he would give his first speech. So I ran from my car, and every other reporter did the same thing, and sort of drove into town to get to the square in the middle of Cape Town where he was going to give his speech. And I shoved my way into the middle of the square. And I remember at times my feet lifting off the ground because the crush of people around me in the square was so intense that, I mean, I'm 6 foot tall, I'm not sort of super light, but, I would just be hoisted up into the air by the crush of people. And Mandela was very late coming out to speak. And so everybody was in the square with the African sun beating down on their heads for, 2 hours, 3 hours, and people were incredibly thirsty. Some people were fainting. You could hear glass being shattered at shop windows around the square because people were desperate to get some drink. So they would, find a grocery store and go in and steal the soft drinks because they were so thirsty. And so it was intense. And that's before you even get to what Mandela said when he came out, and sort of the grace with which he kind of, just didn't show bitterness about the fact that 27 years of his life had been stolen from him by being put in jail for believing in racial equality. So this is unbelievably intense stuff. And then the question comes as a writer, well, how do you communicate that to people who are not there, and who, what do you do to capture the grandeur, the historical moment of what you've just been through? And it's almost a separate thing to experience it, with the flesh of other people on your flesh and you're lifted into the air. And on the other hand, express what it means for Africa, for audiences around the world. I mean, there's could be slightly different things. And so I think what you need in those moments is the ability somehow to put words around almost indescribable, high excitement, high significance. So, and you come across this a lot, later on. It turns out I had lots of other exciting things go on in my writing career. But, right now I'm grappling with the subject of artificial intelligence. And, that demands you to sort of try and put down on paper quite how awesome this invention is, like the first kind of non-human high-level intelligence to be introduced to the environment. I mean, what is this? Is this the printing press? No, it's bigger than that, because that was just like a way of disseminating human thought. Now we've got a source of non-human thought. It's different. It's like way bigger. And so, you kind of scrabble around, and, maybe one idea is that this is the most significant thing to happen to the Earth since human beings developed the capacity for abstract thought 70,000 years ago. I mean, maybe that's the analogy. But that is the trick. It's like, it's huge. Everybody knows it's huge. But how do you articulate the size of it? That is an art which I continue to both struggle with, but also find satisfying, to grapple with.
Yeah. And, sometimes as you think about grand ideas, it helps to start dissecting them into smaller categories and kind of starting, one step at a time. So are there any AI tools that you've been using in your work, or just, life? What are your thoughts on the usefulness? And have you found something where it was particularly helpful in what you were writing or researching?
Well, of course, we should remember that, we forget the things are AI as soon as we've used them for a while. So, any predictive text that you might use in any Google product, of course, that's AI. There's AI all around us. And so everybody, all of us, is experimenting with it all the time. In terms of the new products, I mean, I have played around with GPT-4, and I find it pretty useful. Although, of course, it's the cliche, it does hallucinate a bit. But I think it's gotten, there are two stories here. One is that it's gotten better, because if you compare sort of how things were when ChatGPT was first released and then when GPT-4 was first released, the ability to drive it into hallucination and say racist things and be offensive and declare love to you and all that kind of stuff. I mean, clearly these models are not allowed to do that anymore. So, the engineers have been working hard, and they have sort of safeguarded the models further using, reinforcement learning through human feedback, basically red teaming the hell out of these things until they behave like the children who have been told by their parents not to say certain things at the dinner table. And eventually you shape their manners into something that's not going to get them into trouble. And it's the same with these systems. So I think they've gotten better. There's a kind of counter story that it's expensive to serve the biggest version of the model to users in terms of compute and electricity. And so once you've got a decent flow of users, you quietly, degrade how much compute you're letting them use. And I'm told by people who know the behind the scenes story, there might be a bit of that going on. But I think, look, I'm very bullish on this stuff, and I think it's already astonishing. It will become better and better, and it's already great for coders who want to be more productive. It's pretty useful, I think, for writers who want to be more productive. Although the difference is that with code, you can run the code and see if it works or not. Whereas with writing, you may not know, you can't just do one thing that would check whether there's any factual error in the output you're getting. So I wouldn't ever rely on it, but I would consult it, just like I would talk to a source, and I would check what they say before I use it.
Yeah. And one question I like to ask people is what they are contrarian about when it comes to some of these topics. And on the topic of AI, I find that, or my prediction is that a lot of it will actually help to make us more human. And so here's a couple of examples. Sometimes people would have these conversations where they'll say that, this takes humanity out of us if people start, using these tools to type something, etc. And there's something so special about human communication. But that assumes that you are communicating with a human who is very effective at that, right? And we all know that that's not true. Even the best of us sometimes face situations where we wish we express something differently, right? And I'm not even talking about neurodiversity sort of related issues with communication, but just in general, one of my use cases is I use email server Superhuman, and their recent capability is around, typing emails. And I hate rejecting people. I'm much more comfortable with taking rejection myself. But the one thing that I found is I use Superhuman to draft my rejection emails, and they come out so much nicer. And, I'm Eastern European. Most of my responses would be sort of like, no thanks, right? Or something like that. But it drafts something that sounds just so much nicer. And I've gotten emails back from people saying, this is the sweetest email I've ever received. And so,
now your secret is out. You've said it on a podcast.
It's all good, because sometimes I would say drafted by Superhuman, but the intention and the emotion is mine. And I think that that's what matters, right? So anyways, I think one is that these tools can actually make us more human. But the second thing is that, very often people talk about the decline of creativity. And I actually think that a lot of these tools separate the technical ability to produce something from the idea of, using that means of expression to articulate a thought, right? And when we put these tools in the hands of a lot of people, then all of a sudden we enable people who can't write music to become composers. And I think that will unleash a whole new wave of creativity, of very different talent coming into it. So I'm incredibly bullish on technology overall. But let me go back to my original question. So what are some of the things in the world of technology, AI specifically, maybe, or it can be broader, that you are contrarian about?
I think I'm a bit contrarian in my view of the type of AI risk, which is known as the sort of alignment problem. In other words, how do you align the model in a way that it won't decide that to get to the goal of, let's say, getting the pollution out of the ocean, it doesn't suddenly figure out a way to transfer oxygen from the atmosphere into the ocean, get rid of the pollution, the algae and whatever, but in the same time asphyxiate the human race. So this is, I didn't just make that example up. That was in a Financial Times essay, which is actually a very, very good essay. But that particular example, my contrarian view is that that's just stupid. I mean, it's absurd. You have to believe that, first of all, the humans programmed the system in a way that didn't foresee that kind of thing. Secondly, that then the system can't be unplugged. Thirdly, that the system manages to connect itself to some chemical plant that's going to make this enzyme or whatever it is that's going to transfer the oxygen. You don't know where the plant is, because otherwise you would just go and shut it down, or blow it up or attack it with a bomb or something. So you have to believe in a whole bunch of completely implausible scenarios for the kind of, ex machina or sort of, that kind of movie type, sci-fi type, the machine gets its own will and starts coming after the humans because the machines are more intelligent. I think what that misses is that although machines will be more intelligent for sure, there's the question of your objective function, your will. Humans are wired by evolution to care about survival above all else, whereas machines are wired by their programmers for a bunch of other objective functions, and their own survival is not the main thing. And even, if you imagine that they somehow evolved to have that sense of survival, which I'm not quite sure anyone's really specified how you would evolve that way, but then you would get multiple machines that would evolve in different directions, and they wouldn't all be evolving to the same point, it seems to me. So I just think, it's a cliche about any military analysis of any war that the side that is more motivated has an advantage. And in any putative war between the human beings and the robots in the future, human beings will be 100% motivated to survive as a race, and the machines won't be optimizing for that, it seems to me.
Yeah, there's lots of different ways of thinking about these problems, and I'm definitely on the side of techno optimism, and I do think that it's very important for us to create the correct regulatory frameworks for a lot of this technology. But the benefits probably do outweigh some of the potential issues, or at least, I like to think that we can be in control of managing that. And so perhaps in the conclusion of our conversation, I like to ask something lighter, something more personal. And since you've spent a lot of time in the UK, you live in London, what do you think are the most underrated and overrated things about the UK?
Okay, so off the top of my head, I'd say that an exaggerated perception is that the weather is bad all the time. The truth is it's only bad some of the time.
And that's 75% still counts as some of the time.
No. I think it's better than that. And maybe it's a beneficiary of global warming in that sense.
Also, it's not bad weather, it's only bad clothes, so.
I lived in Japan for 3 years, and then I lived in the US for 18 years, and I came back to Britain, and I was sort of pleasantly surprised about how livable it was. I think my favorite sort of distinctive thing about Britain is the sense of humor, starting with Monty Python, which I still think is an all-time classic, going through a TV series called The Thick of It, which is sort of like The West Wing, only 1,000% funnier. And then moving from that to Sacha Baron Cohen, who, does Ali G and all these things, which I think are genius. And maybe even a TV show called Gogglebox, which if you ever come to the UK or you figure out a way of seeing the UK version of it, as a foreigner, it's just a terrific way of both having fun and sort of getting a view on Britain. And the concept is you have about 5 different British families sitting on their couches at home watching the same TV program. And the show kind of flits from one living room and capturing that family's reaction to whatever it is they're watching. Could be the news, could be a new drama on TV, whatever. And they just have hilarious reactions. And then it goes to the next, household. So the first one may be a kind of Northern English family with sort of, let's say, Arabic speaking roots. Okay, so you've got a kind of immigrant type family in the north of England. Then you've got a very kind of white gin and tonic swilling Southern, kind of pink corduroy, pink pants, sort of, get that for the man, I mean, sort of character in the South. And then you've got some only semi-intelligible Scottish family because their accents are so strong. And then you just got a bunch of different people. And they're one of the ones that they go back to a lot, sort of very self-consciously camp, sort of overdressed gay couple, and they're really funny. And so it's a slice of modern British life. It's just also really funny. Goggle Box, highly recommend.
Yes, well, thank you for all these recommendations. I have a long flight coming up, so this should keep me entertained. And yes, British humor is certainly one of the things that I miss the most about my life in the UK, and it feels like it's something that maybe is doesn't always get enough credit. But Sebastian, it's been such a pleasure to talk to you about all of these different topics. It's always great to talk about to talk with journalists because they have so many different perspectives, and really enjoyed this conversation.
Yeah, me too, Olga. Thank you for having me. Take care.
Thanks so much for listening to the Village Global podcast. You can check us out online at villageglobal.vc. We'd love to hear from you, your feedback, your ideas, your inspirations. You can email us at hello@villageglobal.vc.